All right, we are now on chapter 4 of that Hideous Strength. We're in a slightly different location, but this should work out fine, right? We're just all kind of hanging out on our nice cushy chairs. So I have described it pretty much every chapter as being a slow burn, and I think the burn, the temperature will increase somewhat gradually each time, but it's kind of incessant. Like every chapter is going to ratchet up. So as we were chatting outside about the slow burn nature, and then Mary says, "Well, there's already been a murder," and like, yes, there has been. So that escalation is going to continue to happen pretty much every chapter, and it's gonna move at a pace that you won't even realize that it is accelerated so far and so much until we're in the thick of it, and then you, oh my goodness, like how? Yeah. Well, it may be. I mean, this is it's gonna get pretty dicey, and it's already starting to get there. It's relatively subtle, but the tension, the pressure, the speed, the stakes are going to continue to rise every time. And I think ratchet is the appropriate term. Like I think of the ratchet straps that I use in my truck sometimes, and with every crank of the ratchet, the gears allow the strap to get tighter, but they don't allow it to loosen. Not until you release the whole mechanism, because the gears only go in one way. And that is, I think, kind of the operative understanding of how these chapters will work. They will continue to ratchet, and the pressure is only going to go in one way. It is not going to loosen up. It's just going to get a little higher each time. So we have the most subsections so far. I think we hit like 7 subsections within this chapter. And we've been doing like maybe 4. And every subsection, for the most part, has been kind of a back and forth. So we're still sort of in a split narrative here. We have our 2 protagonists. Mark and Jane typically have their own subsection. And the storyline for each one of them is running relatively independently of the other. They're kind of running in parallel. You know, we used to have to drive before we moved to South Florida. We would drive down to South Florida with some frequency to visit my wife's parents. And I would take the turnpike from Central Florida down, and then at some particular location, you could take the turnpike all the way down, but I was looking to save money on tolls. I would take it down to about Jupiter, and State Road 70 runs across the state, east and west at Jupiter, Fort Pierce. So you could do either one. I think we would often get off at Fort Pierce, that's State Road 70, and then further south at Jupiter, same thing sort of happens, and we would pick up I-95. And 95 basically goes up the coast. And so where we were going was sort of, it was accessible from either one, 95 or the turnpike. It was going to be the same exit, we just a little bit further drive. But we're going to save like, $7 or $8 in tolls by getting off a little early. And kind of the interesting thing was, though the turnpike kind of comes down the center of the state, and then it starts to veer slightly east as it approaches South Florida and getting into like the Palm Beach, Broward County, Dade County kind of area. 95 runs up the East Coast. 75 runs up the Gulf Coast until we hit Tampa, and then it starts to veer towards the center, and then the turnpike and 75 come together, north of Wildwood, Leesburg, but south of Ocala. And so, basically I spent so much of my life driving up to Gainesville, and it would be for us in Orlando, you take the east-west to the turnpike, take the turnpike until it ends and blends straight into 75, and then 75 goes north, straight up the middle of the state. Going south, we would take the turnpike, and then somewhere, Fort Pierce, Jupiter, or wherever, we would be really close to 95 and hop onto that and finish going south. That somewhat long digression is to say, here are these major arteries and thoroughfares. Like, you can't get more major in the state of Florida than I-95, I-75, and the Turnpike. And for a lot of their main directions where they're supplying roadway, they're not close to each other, because you pick one or the other based off of where you're located. But then, whether it's in the north, as you approach Ocala, where the turnpike ends and 75 has now come over and blends and it becomes one road, or in South Florida, like I was talking about, they run parallel. Like, you, especially in Jupiter, when you pull off, you can like look through the trees and you can see 95. And so they run, there's a relatively lengthy section where they run in sight of each other, going the exact same direction, sometimes the same speed, although 95 tended to get a little more crowded, which is why, pay money to be on the turnpike and go faster. But they run parallel to each other until once again they kind of finish off in their own direction. So again, this long digression is to talk about this interesting narrative structure of the two protagonists having their own storyline. And there are times where they are running parallel in the sense of they're all, just like those roads that I mentioned, they're all running north and south. They're roughly going in the same direction. There are a few times where the roads are close enough where you can see, like, you can kind of look through the trees and see them, but for the most part, they start veering off. And even though they're both going, let's say, north and south, they're not very close to each other. And so we skip back and forth in these subsections. There's Mark in Edgestowe, or there is Jane in St. Anne's, or Jane back home. Oh, now Mark comes home and the roads kind of merge for a little bit, or they're running parallel but super, super close, and then they veering off again. And so, will this be a story like South Florida, where 95 and the Turnpike will always be separate from one another, like an asymptote that never touches? Or will they be like North Florida, where they blend in together and form one route? We're just not there yet. We're still in two separate stories, two separate protagonists. There's overlap for sure. But not only are they dealing with things kind of in their own way, with their own sort of subset cast of characters, Mother Demble hasn't appeared in really anything that has to do with Mark, nor has Wither met Jane at all. But the rough, broad strokes of the area and the town and the issues and Nice are all kind of operating in both of their backgrounds. But how close or far are they to the specific elements is kind of unique to their own story right now. And chapter 4 is no different, except we hop a lot. We have, like I said, 7 subsections. So some of these are relatively brief, where we'll kind of check in with one before we shift off to the other. So we're starting off this chapter is given a little title: The Liquidation of Anachronisms. And that should be evident where that applies throughout the chapter. But I want us to consider for a minute what the connotations of that phrase. What's an anachronism is basically an object or an item that seems out of place because it's out of date. Something that is anachronistic stands out to us because it doesn't seem to fit in the current time period. Now, we tend to think about anachronisms when we're like watching a movie or something, where either it's out of place on purpose, or if we know something about that time period and we notice a mistake that the production company has made. There are always little like little bloopers or something where maybe it's some kind of period piece or some kind of like fantasy, and somebody's forgotten to take off their watch, or they had a water bottle on the scene, or if you look carefully enough in the background, you can see a car driving. Little funny like little bloopers, but it can also be a part of the plot as well. One of the most famous contemporary time travel stories, Back to the Future, is predicated on these anachronisms where the kid from 1985 goes back and meets his parents 30 years prior in 1955, and his presence as someone from the 80s really stands out in a bunch of ways. And it could be that, I don't know how well you remember the movie. I feel like I've seen it a million times. When Marty McFly finds himself stuck in the past, and he figures out, my only hope is to figure out where Doc Brown is in 1955, because he's the only one who can help me get back. So he needs a way to do that. So he goes into a diner to look at their phone book and find his number and stuff. And if you remember, he goes in the diner and he's wearing like a super common 1980s jacket it's like a vest jacket, which I had one of those in the 80s, like a sleeveless, it's kind of like a winter jacket, but it didn't have sleeves. And the guy at the counter is like, "What, did you just jump off the ship in the Coast Guard? You're still wearing your life preserver." And then he says, the guy says, "We want to order something," and Marty McFly says, "Yeah, give me a tab." Which, if you said to a kid in 2025, they would say, "I don't know what you mean." But in 1985, tab was a drink. It was a diet soft drink. It was like before there was Diet Coke, they had tab, which I think is way long gone. I don't think it exists anymore. Yeah, it was like saccharin or something. It was really bad. So anyway, he says, "Well, give me a tab." And the guy's like, "I can't give you a tab. You haven't ordered anything," because he hears tab and he thinks like the receipt at the end where the charge. And so Marty finally says, "Well, I don't know, just give me something without sugar." And so he pours him a cup of black coffee and hands it to him. So that's an anachronism, where in 1955, you don't expect an 80s style sleeveless jacket, and anyone who asked for a tab would be very out of place, meaning a soft drink that didn't exist yet. So an anachronism in that sense is something out of place because it's out of time. We would use that outside of like stories in real life. We might say something is anachronistic when we mean it is a vestige of an older time period, and I don't know why it's still around. Every now and again we're driving and I will see a phone booth, and I point it out to the kids like it's a museum. "Hey, look, kids, a phone booth." And they're like, "Okay." But I mean, you think they even work? Like a phone booth that's out there, do you think it would actually have like a dial tone or something? I don't know. I think it was one of those, like, I don't think it works or anything, but they just never tore it down, maybe.
The UK, they use their, the red ones.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
They use them as little lending libraries, like we
Yeah.
have there.
So because they're not actually connected to
Right.
phones anymore. They're not pay phones. You're not putting a quarter in there or whatever. Kids today will never know the habit or the joy of walking past every phone booth and every gumball machine and sticking your finger in the slot, because every 100th time there's a quarter that somebody forgot. So these things are anachronisms when they stand out to us as being out of typically out of date, like, oh, that's so old fashioned. I actually have a landline in our house that we've maintained all these years. Even though it's, I mean, it's done through our internet service, but when I first started, I had a landline because it was actually in my letter of agreement that the clergy is supposed to have a published number and all that kind of stuff. And we just kept it because, why not? And at this point, all it is are like spam calls and CVS saying that a prescription's ready. But every house had phone jacks built into the wall. Now, what are they used for? But they're all there. We have some in this room, a phone jack just built into the wall that will never be used again. So to come across something like that, you would think, what an anachronism. My son found at a garage sale and promptly bought it and then didn't want it anymore. So now I had to figure out what to do with it. A real REEL lawnmower, like one of those non-powered mowers where you just push it and it turns. And I'm like, I don't think I've ever seen one up close. That's an anachronism. Anachronisms don't have to be negative. They can just be noteworthy, but they're often used as a pejorative. Something that's out of place because it's out of date, because old-fashioned in our contemporary culture and in the culture of the 50s, old-fashioned meant bad. Because if we are progressing as a society in technology, in our understanding, in our culture, then whatever it is we left behind must be deficient somehow. When we say something's old-fashioned, we don't generally mean that as like charming. We could. It's not always negative, but I think we typically say something is old-fashioned with a little bit of like, out of date. And an anachronism would be used again to describe something that no longer should be there. It's out of place. It doesn't just stand out because it's interesting. It's out of place. We're going to be faced with a few anachronisms, or at least something described as an anachronism. Much of the college and the surrounding land is seen as anachronistic, out of date, old-fashioned, needs to make way for progress. We're going to rip up trees. We're going to plow up fields because we're going to build new and modern facilities. And these little towns, the little farmlands filled with average people, that's got to go. The little cozy pub is an anachronism in our modern 1950s, is there any architecture that looks any worse and dated than the modern from the 50s to like the late 70s? I mean, it stands up like modern architecture, brutalism, it just stands out like a sore thumb. Imagine, can you remember the old Howard Johnsons and how unique those were? Like, and you can always pick out an old Howard Johnson's that still exists. It's been renamed 4 or 5 times into different things. But it's like a Pizza Hut. You can always pick out an old Pizza Hut building. So that super angular, that was considered modern architecture, and like this is the future. The Jetsons are going to lead the way. And it didn't happen that way. We moved on to something else. And now it stands out as like super old-fashioned and not in a way that feels classic. We can look at older buildings and it seems kind of pleasing to us. But we look at something that was made in this relatively short span of a couple of decades, and it really, really stands out as not being connected to the past and no longer being used in the future. Poor Disney World, every generation has to completely redo Tomorrowland because Tomorrowland becomes the past. You know, you look at some of the stuff that they were doing in the 70s and the 80s, and it's way, way, way out of date. And some of the stuff they extrapolated that, well, in the future, we're going to do X, Y, Z. We're like, no, like that's crazy old fashioned to think we're still using big, giant cassettes for data storage. Like, you just don't do that. So, though, again, the anachronisms that are being used, it is a pejorative in this chapter. These things are out of date and they're wrong. They're wrong to still be around. They have outlived their usefulness and their purpose, and something better must take their place. The Dimbles are being turned out of their home. Professor Dimble is an anachronism. He and his wife, who had a big, house kind of on campus property, assuming they would have a bunch of kids, but when they weren't able to have kids, they basically became parents to generation after generation of college students, welcoming them into their home, cooking meals, giving them a safe spot, giving them, kind of guidance and advice. Well, that's anachronistic. Bill the Blizzard as being an academic of a previous sort and not on board with NICE. He is anachronistic. And what's happening to all of these anachronisms? They got to go. That's just it. They are being liquidated. When we think about liquidation, the sad truth is I only have two definitions that spring to mind. One is not good and one is horrific. When we think liquidation, in my mind, I'm thinking like a going out of business where not only are you selling off all your stock, all of the retail merchandise that you have, but like when you go into a business that's actually closing, it's not one of those, we're going out of business sales that they have every 6 months. But when they actually close and they start selling fixtures, that's a liquidation. Like everything has got to go because it's dead. We're just selling, it's not even dying. It's dead at that point. We're just selling off the pieces. The other way liquidation is used was the Holocaust, which just means in a clinical, widespread, and almost externally objective fact. Like I'm not even, because we don't, you are an object. You're not even a person. We liquidate stock. We don't liquidate people except when they did, because they treated them like just objects to be disposed of. So I read these words with a lot of purpose. The liquidation of anachronisms. Things that we have decided are old-fashioned, are not just out of place, they must be destroyed. They've got to be replaced. But this isn't a nice, like, would you please step to the side so I can put something in here? No, they have to be annihilated. They must be fully and completely removed. The little town has to be plowed up. Mark is given an assignment. Explain in ways that the public won't kick a fuss up about that this sleepy little village that was causing no harm to anybody has to be destroyed. And we're going to use words that people don't argue with about, oh, that pub is unhygienic, or whatever words they were talking about. We need people to, if not get on board, at least not fight us. And if we explain how crummy their current state of affairs are and how much cleaner and nicer, more efficient and healthy the alternative is, either people will agree with us, or at least they just won't put up a fuss. But that's how we are going to liquidate these anachronisms. And if they fight, like Bill the Blizzard, they'll be annihilated. He is, as alluded to in Mark's story, but seen through her visions in Jane's story. Him publicly rejecting working for NICE, and not even in a I'm going to fight you kind of way, but just like, you know what, I'm out. I'm just going to go back to school and keep my head down and do my normal academic work. Mark, you should do the same. I'm just going to go back home. This isn't for me. He wasn't really an adversary. He wasn't saying, I'm going to fight this tooth and nail, or I'll stop you, NICE. He just like, I'm noping out. But that's not good enough. This is the Hotel California. You can check in, you cannot check out. He tried, and they ambushed him. And he fought. You know, the old academic who you wouldn't think would put up much of a fuss. But he went out like a blizzard. And the interesting thing is, he is not shown to be a particularly admirable man. Now, he seemed to be a true expert in his field, which I think should and could be appreciated. He seems to be an honest speaker, which I also think is a good thing. Lewis really tamps down what could be perceived as praise. We talked about this last week, because if you remember, he is unwilling to take any kind of moral stance on anything. Everything is a matter of taste. Even what is starting to become overt evil is just a matter of taste. And that's a huge and massive failing. But ultimately, even this guy who has this kind of critical failure, he goes out like a boss. You know, I want to give it to this guy that he doesn't go quietly. He realizes this is not for him, and he tries to leave. And even when they try to pull him over, he fights off 3 of them until he can't anymore, and they finally get the best of him. And they're, Bill the Blizzard, an obvious atheist. Bill the Blizzard, who, unfortunately, it will be people like that who say, well, to each his own on matters that should not be considered one of taste. How much harm is allowed when we just say, como si, como sa. Everybody has their own kind of thing. This is if I didn't give this this Lewis quote earlier, I think it fits into the Bill the Blizzard archetype here. Lewis was comparing the differences in cultures, just in a very, very broad sense. He wasn't taking any specific cultures. But he said, one culture can teach to love your enemy, and another culture can teach you should eat your enemy. Those are not the same. So when we just like, all cultures are equivalent, or, all morality is so culturally constrained that we should just, oh, well, they're just different than us and they've got their own way. Like, yeah, but some things are just wrong. Those are not equivalents. And you don't have to pretend that your culture is perfect in order to point out genuine problems in a different one. So, would NICE have even advanced as far as it had without the basically implicit support or the complicity of people like Bill the Blizzard, who just said, well, that's not how I would do it, but whatever. These are some of the ways that the story is going to potentially remind us of very familiar things, in our own culture, in our own time, in our own struggles. Where do you draw lines? Where do you make moral stands? What are matters of taste and what are matters of right and wrong? And then how do you handle that? How should we handle that? How far do we let things go before something needs to change? How do we know it needs to change? Is change good for change's sake, or is change something that also needs to be very carefully done and thoughtfully approached? Now, NICE is not doing any of this stuff accidentally. I'm assuming we all see that right now there's a plan in place. It's a very deliberate plan. But so this quote doesn't really apply to NICE because they're not, this isn't incidental. They're doing all this on purpose. But there's another, very, very useful Chesterton quote, and C.S. Lewis is a great admirer of G.K. Chesterton, the English author. And Chesterton basically says, never take down a fence until you're really sure why it was put up in the first place. And he gives the illustration of somebody like they move onto a property and they see this old fence that's been there for far too long, and like, that's in a weird place and it's kind of broken down, and let's just get rid of it and we'll just pull it all down. The problem was, because they didn't understand why it was there, they opened themselves up to all sorts of unintended consequences. Maybe that was there because you don't see it now, but come the springtime, there's a flock of sheep and it's going to actually come over and it's going to cause all sorts of trouble, or maybe it's because of something else. But one of our genuine weaknesses as a contemporary culture is we seem to have short memories and an ignorance of history. We all remember from school, perhaps, the Santayana quote about those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. There seems to be a very easy sense of history began with me, or 10 years ago, or whenever I started paying attention. And the stuff that happened before is either irrelevant or it's an anachronism and it's wrong. So progress means that has to be rejected. I feel like I'm bouncing back and forth from quote to quote, but another Lewis quote, true progress is acknowledging when you are going in the wrong direction and changing directions. The idea being that, well, this is progress because we're moving forward. Yeah, but what if you're going the wrong direction? That's not actually progress. So the most progressive thing would be to like stop and turn around and go back and do something different. What NICE is doing feels like progress for progress' sake. It's not identifying why the fence is there. Why do these little villages exist? Why would they have a little pub? Why would the people be the way that they are? Why would the college have this and that? All these different things. But again, this is not a neutral thing. This is not even someone who is just inconsiderate. Remember, this is a plan. NICE is enacting a plan. They are seeking to destroy in order to recreate. There was, and this really led to philosophically and culturally, modernity, or the modern does not mean contemporary. It actually means a period of history of which we are no longer in. It depends on who you're asking and how they're defining it, but the modern era is roughly from the late 1800s to about maybe the 70s, maybe the 80s. We tend to use the word modern in kind of a just very casual fashion to mean contemporary. Contemporary, which means now. But they actually don't mean that. at least not in a technical sense. So we tend to say modern, like as of now, but modern really had a very specific worldview. And a lot of the stuff that grew out of that, like the architecture, is founded from that worldview. And that worldview is scientific. And that worldview has a presumption of we will figure everything out. Science will lead the way. And there is an answer to, there's a solution to every question. And we just need to figure it out. We are past that culturally. We are past that societally, academically. And what is generally referred to as the postmodern period, which basically has said, we assumed and we tried really hard to solve everything as though it were an equation with a singular answer. And that there was an arrogance to that assumed that everything was basically a math problem. And it's not. Life is more complicated than that. And sometimes there can be a lot of answers or no answer. And just by assuming that the experts will have the answer, you reject a lot of knowledge or wisdom or truth that happens outside of the math problem. That's why postmodernity is typically marked with narratives. Back in the modern period, you didn't talk about my truth. Truth was very singular. And you could figure it out in a laboratory. But then we started realizing that, well, maybe you can't figure that out in a laboratory. And now the postmodern period has kind of moved into your truth, my truth, because it has to do with my experience, my lived experience, especially. Well, there are other ways of knowing. There are indigenous ways of knowing. There are cultural ways of knowing. There are feminist ways of knowing. There are, and all of these are just set up as different ways of understanding the world, of coming with a solution, of approaching truth. And postmodernism is basically marked by the multitude of narratives. Individual stories are the more appropriate, if not more accurate way to approach reality and try to discover whatever truth might be, rather than assuming it's like a math problem. Philosophically, I would argue they're both wrong and they're both right. They have weaknesses and strengths. When you're in the middle of one of these eras, you just kind of assume, well, that's what it is. It seems kind of obvious, like, well, duh. And it's only when that era tends to either peter out or smash into problems that we have to start looking for ways to replace it. And like a pendulum swinging, sometimes it swings too far on one end, and the correction is to swing it too far in the other end. Modernity, with its assumption that industry and science and expertise would solve all problems, leads to World War II and the Holocaust. And that was an enormous reckoning. Both World War I and World War II, of societies coming from that trauma and like treating everything like a math problem didn't work. And it made things worse and not better. There's got to be another way to do this. And that's where, a lot of these, multiple narratives and stuff come from. Though this might seem like a digression, understand this is in the absolute thick of modernity here, where nice is the embodiment of scientific bureaucracy that says life is a math problem and we have the singular solution. Through our expertise, we can run the world the right way. The frightening part is we're starting to meet some of these people who are going to run the world. And these are the people that you wouldn't want even as a neighbor, let alone in charge of you. we met Reverend Strake, who is a super interesting character in a sense, repugnant and repulsive. But here's Mark seeing himself as a sophisticated academic. And he may not be like a super aggressively overt atheist, because, like every, young Englishman still in the 50s, he was raised, with, even if he wasn't attending church as a child, his school probably had chapel time, and it was just such a ubiquitous part of the culture. You're kind of raised and steeped in these things. But of course, that's sort of childish to him and whatever. So he's shocked to see like a collar wearing clergyman at Nice. Like, I thought we were all the scientists and stuff. And scientists obviously have, they don't believe in superstitious faith kind of things. So what's this guy doing? And we meet in Reverend Strake a particular type of clergy person who I wish was only a fictional caricature. But I've met some people who they kind of edge over to this direction. I mean, I don't know about anybody being quite this extreme, but here's a guy who has so focused on secondary outcomes of the gospel that the gospel itself can be eliminated and rejected as wicked. Secondary elements. We are in an alternate location today because we had another meeting going on where we normally meet. And one of the purposes of that meeting were churches coming together to address issues within our community for the better. How can we use our desire to do right and to do good as Christians in our numbers so that our neighborhoods and our communities better reflect gospel principles for the benefit of those in need? Now, all that seems absolutely right. But if a church began to exist only to accomplish a particular community need, to the rejection of the gospel that ought to inspire it, it wouldn't be much of a church at all. And yet, how many times have people gotten involved? And this is within the church, but in other areas of life too. They get so involved in a subset or an element of it that they lose sight of the whole. Strake is an atheist, except he would reject that label because he's kind of beyond labels. Nice, all the nice people are beyond labels in their own little way. But he is rejecting any of the supernatural. He is rejecting anything other than the teachings of Jesus that allow him to accomplish what he thinks ought to be accomplished. And everything else about the gospel that doesn't further the aims that he has decided, where in the Lord's Prayer, on earth as it is in heaven, will no longer be a thy will, but a his will. Whatever we think of as heavenly, we are going to create right here and right now. And it is, by definition, going to be omelet making that requires the breaking of eggs. And he's super straight up with that. Certain people will need to be destroyed, I think he says. And this is coming from, again, a collar-wearing clergyman. But he's so fixated on some end goal that must be achieved that everything that should have been motivating the desire for that goal is not only tossed out the window, it's basically said, I'll do the exact opposite. because only the end goal matters. And then you have to start wondering what that end goal is really going to look like. What is his heaven on earth really going to look like? Being remade in our image and being placed a little lower than the angels. This guy's quoting scripture. But remember, in the wilderness, while being tempted, the devil quotes scripture to Jesus too. I would like to say that no faithful clergy would be so horrible and so maniacal in their aims, but I do think it happens. Although I guess that's when you stop calling them faithful clergy. I see no faithfulness in somebody like Strake. The gospel itself and his ordination, I suppose, simply becomes a means to an end. And that end also seems to be, again, like Nice, utter control. And he says, oh, these materialists, these atheists and all these other people, yeah, I'm using them. They're using me. So what? Because the only thing that matters is this end product. The end product is not worship. The end product is not fellowship with God. The end product is not our discipleship. It is not our theosis or divination. It's not any of these things that we would even broadly understand as the goal of a Christian or the church. But it is some ideal that he's got in his head that he is then willing to do terrible things in order to achieve this end. I heard a podcast a few weeks ago about Jim Jones of the mass suicide in Guyana fame, and about how, like, we can hear the story after the fact, and I don't know if any of you were aware of it at the time. It predates me, but don't drink the Kool-Aid is now a phrase used to mean don't jump in too deeply on any one issue before you really know what it's about. And now we say, oh, so-and-so's drinking the Kool-Aid. That means they have basically bought into an entire system without thinking through the implications. Well, what is lost to people like me who weren't around then or before that fact was Jim Jones was seen as like this super great guy who was deep in his city for racial reconciliation, who lived a life of this amazing humility, and was doing like all these super positive things for his community. And if you remove all of the mass murder from the end, you would assume looking at this guy like, oh, what a modern day saint. And maybe he was at some point. Or if things didn't go bad, maybe they were always bad, but all you could tell from the outside were the positive things. But it led to something horrific. Just horrific. Well, we identify that now, but before the movement gets too big and before they go down to Guyana, he was like, there were national publications singing this guy's praises because he was doing like what you would assume are very, very positive things. When does it cross the line, or was it always across the line, but we never saw it? I don't know. But that's kind of, I think, where we are with this character of Strake. But then again, Strake is just another way of looking at Nice. Is there something inherently wrong about updating, modernizing, increased hygiene, like, using scientific principles to make it, all these things kind of sound like, okay, generally fine. Like, I appreciate modern medicine. I like the fact that, chemo drugs are better today than they were even 10 years ago. That's super important to me as we have parishioners undergoing chemo, that the treatments are more effective all the time. But that's not a blank check to say anything goes if it comes from somebody wearing a lab coat or somebody saying, I'm here from the government, or somebody saying, but I'm an expert, or I have a PhD, or this, or that. And each of these people that we're meeting have kind of in their own way this little air of expertise on the nice side, but they're all pointing to this plan. And we can, I think, see just how much trouble it's already going to be. The question is, how bad is it going to get? We still don't know what NICE is actually trying to do. We're getting bits and pieces, and it sounds ominous, but it sounds like a lot of plans and proposals we could have come across even today about how such and such is going to get changed and it's going to be better. How different is the classroom in an elementary school these days? You know, if you've been in it, you know, over consistently over the time period, you've just been given more things to do and more changes all the time, and you've had to adjust little by little. But like, you know, my mom's been retired now for 10 years. Ain't no way. No way. If you just kind of plopped her, you know, even at her age, like at her retirement age, if you could just like pluck her from 2014 and drop her into a third grade classroom today, I think she would just look, what are we supposed to do with all this? All of the little rules and regulations. I am scheduled to do an 8-hour in-person video training tomorrow because I coach. And it's a state law that just got passed. And it's about youth mental health. Fine. But I have to take a day off of work to do this requirement.
The week after I retired, and I signed up to do some substitute teaching. I found it. I'd had to take a class to learn how to be a substitute teacher.
Yeah, right. Checking these boxes, and there are more boxes all the time, and the boxes get bigger and more numerous all the time. And did it make anything safer or smarter? So this is kind of where we are now. Jane's story is running parallel to this. She is seeing a little more of the side effects. This is like feeling the rumblings of the bulldozer without actually seeing it because it's just over the hill. But she's starting to feel the effects now that Mother Dimble is kind of being pulled into her own home, and what, you know, realizing that this lifestyle that she personally benefited from is being lost forever. This idea of what the Dimbles did for students for generations, they have helped year after year and made an influence on so many kids' lives, will never happen again. And they're now off to St. Anne's. Like, we can't fight it. We can't restart. We're gonna go to Miss Ironwood and St. Anne's, and life is just gonna be changed now. And so this is where we are. I've not taken our chapter linearly, but I've tried to cover, you know, a lot of these points that have come up and a lot of the elements of the narrative. Let's get to one last thing that I didn't bring up, and that's how it ends.
Yeah.
You know, Mark has been very easily led because he is young and he's inexperienced, and he's also a little vain. And he likes the idea of being invited into the inner circle of NICE. He loves the thought of maybe getting more money. But he's trying to be careful because they're being so ridiculously vague. He hasn't signed any kind of contract. He hasn't been getting any kind of numbers. He's still wondering if he's, you know, what the money is going to be like, because everything is like, yeah. So, he's even had to tell Jane, no, of course I haven't quit my job at the college. That would be crazy. But how does the chapter end? Feverstone. Oh, yes. Mark wanted me to tell you. He's quit. So None of these guys are on the up and up. But now, without him even knowing it, Mark's backup plan or lifeline or safety net is being cut without his knowledge, being removed without him even realizing it. Because you can check in, but you can't check out. All right, what else?
Then it ends, the chapter ends even more than that. They hear what sounds like machine guns outside.
Oh, yeah. We don't know what's happened. This is, it's, so, Hardcastle, who we met last chapter, is the head of Nice's police force. They're not even like the security department. They are described as a police force. And they are now working kind of in concert with local and national authorities. But what does that really mean other than they're probably just doing whatever it is they want to do? Having police and security is an important and significant part of any society. And yet, having the checks and balances within a culture or society is how we prevent those who have, as the Bible would describe it, the power of the sword, from taking undue, inappropriate, or wrong actions just because they can. I'm hoping we have all met police officers who are genuine public servants, who legitimately seek to embody, protect, and serve. We may have also met police officers who are bullies and jerks, and for no good reason, and quick to defend themselves, cause more harm than they promote good. And the idea is, even if it's one bad apple, we know that the whole barrel is at risk. So there are laws and procedures and all sorts of safeguards that are supposed to remove the bad apples before they cause too much harm and trouble. And yet, there's always a need to stay on top of that, right? Nobody hates bad cops more than good cops. But after all this time, we still have some bad cops around, don't we? I'm pretty dang sure we do. And a bad cop is a dangerous person. So some people take a little bit of authority and a little bit of power, and they run wild. Some people are the last people who should be given any kind of power or authority. And when they actually get it, bad things happen. And so we have zero idea where this is going yet, but it just seems to have taken almost a crazy turn. This will date the recording, but I just saw last night, again, it was a little YouTube video, but there's some conflict happening. I mean, there's always conflict between Pakistan and India, but it kind of heated up yesterday. And I don't know if you've seen anything about it in the news, whatever, and I have no idea where this will go. Maybe something, maybe nothing. But anyway, there were some YouTube clips of people. One of them was like, I think it was like a taxi driver or something in Pakistan, like his dash cam. And you get like 10 seconds of this guy just kind of doing nothing, driving at night. And then all of a sudden, not way in the distance, but just a couple hundred yards ahead, there's this massive fireball explosion. And this guy kind of freaked out, and you can kind of see him react and respond. And the car kind of like, who's prepared for that? Who is prepared for in the middle of your day something like a massive fireball explosion. And what will this mean next? So we end, it's an ambiguous note we end on, but it is very ominous. And the ratchet strap has been pulled a couple of times and it's just a little tighter, and it's only going to get tighter still.
The breaking of that window that Henrietta Maria had once cut her name with a diamond.
Yes. Again, history is not a part of us. It's an anachronism that is being liquidated. These stories that have meant so much for so many, and they're being casually destroyed to make way for what someone else has decided is better. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much.